The letter landed on the church steps the morning of Mabel Dawson's wedding, not slipped under the door, not handed politely to anyone. Thrown. Garrett Holloway tossed it like garbage from his carriage window, and it skidded across the worn wooden planks until it stopped at Mabel's feet. She picked it up before she understood what it was. The words were short. Garrett had never needed many words to wound someone. Tell the fat girl congratulations. She finally found a man desperate enough, signed with his initials, not even the dignity of a full name. Mabel stood there in a dress that didn't quite button at the back, holding a letter written by the man who had purchased her future, and she made herself breathe. Once, twice, she folded the paper and pressed it into her palm until the edges cut into her skin. She was getting married in 40 minutes, and she was not going to let Garrett Holloway watch her fall apart. This story moves something in you. If you've ever been judged before you were known, please subscribe to this channel and follow Mabel's story all the way to the end. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me the city or country where you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Don't miss what comes next. You're going to want to be here for it. The morning had started the way most hard mornings start, not with drama, but with small, ordinary failures. Mabel woke before dawn, because she always did, habit carved into her by years of farm work that didn't wait for feelings. She lay in the narrow bed she'd slept in since she was 9 years old, and looked at the ceiling, and listened to the silence of a house that used to hold more people, more noise, more of everything. Her mother had died 4 winters back. Her brother had gone to find work in the Eastern Territories and sent letters twice a year that said little. Her father, Walt Dawson, slept 2 rooms away, with the particular heaviness of a man carrying debt he didn't know how to put down. She got up. She washed her face. She started the fire. That was how Mabel had always operated, by moving before she had time to feel the weight of what she was moving toward. The dress was already hanging on the back of the door. Belonged to Clara Finch, who was 2 sizes smaller than Mabel, and had offered it with the particular generosity that comes wrapped in pity. Clara had said, "It's the nicest thing I own, Mabel. Take it, please." And Mabel had thanked her, because the alternative was getting married in her work clothes. She'd let out the seams herself. 2 nights ago, by lamplight, thread that didn't quite match. She'd done the best she could. The waist was still tight and the shoulders pulled, and there was nothing to be done about either without ruining the dress entirely. She got into it by herself. There was no one to help. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand, the only mirror in the house, and she looked at a woman she'd been arguing with her whole life. Round face, wide hips, arms that were strong from work, but not the kind that were considered elegant. She wasn't ugly. She'd made peace with that particular lie a long time ago. She just wasn't what Copper Ridge considered acceptable. She'd heard it her whole life in different shapes. Sometimes it was direct boys at school, men at the general store, the particular brand of casual cruelty that small towns practice without thinking. Sometimes it was gentle, and therefore worse, the way women would tilt their heads and say, "You have such a kind face," as if that were a consolation prize. Sometimes it was in the silence. The way she'd walk into a room and feel the moment people subtracted her from their calculations. She was 31 years old, and she had never once in her life felt like enough. She pinned her hair as best she could and went downstairs to find her father already dressed and sitting at the kitchen table with his hands folded in front of him like a man in a courtroom waiting for judgment. Walt Dawson was 62 and looked older. The drought had done that 3 bad years in a row, then a 4th that broke whatever the first 3 had left standing. He'd borrowed against the land twice. He'd sold the 2 horses that were worth anything. He'd let go of the ranch hand they'd employed since Mabel was a girl, a man named Pete who had cried when he left, and that had been somehow the worst moment of all. When Garrett Holloway came to the farm 8 weeks ago, Walt had been sitting at this same table with unpaid bills spread out in front of him like a failed hand of cards. Garrett hadn't come alone. He'd brought a lawyer named Sinclair and 2 other men, whose function appeared to be standing, and looking significant. Garrett himself was 50 years old, well-dressed, and had the manner of someone who had never in his life been told that something he wanted was unavailable. He'd explained the arrangement simply: Walt's debt, erased, every cent, in exchange for Mabel marrying Ethan Callahan. Mabel had been in the kitchen when they arrived. She'd heard everything through the door. She hadn't been asked. That was the part she kept returning to in the weeks since. Not the transaction itself. She understood that Copper Ridge operated by a different set of rules than the ones she'd have chosen, but the specific and complete absence of her voice in the decision. Her father and Garrett Holloway had discussed her future the way men discuss livestock, with her 20 feet away and the door closed. Walt had come into the kitchen afterward and stood in the doorway and looked at his daughter, and Mabel had looked back at him, and he had said it would save the farm. She'd wanted to ask him what good the farm was if she wasn't on it. She'd wanted to ask him a lot of things. Instead, she'd said, "All right, Pa," because that was what she did. She moved before she had time to feel the weight. Now, he looked up at her from the table, and there was something in his eyes that was not quite an apology but was reaching for one. "You look nice," he said. "Thank you." She poured him coffee, poured herself a cup. She stood at the window and drank it, and watched the dark slowly losing its grip on the sky. "You don't have to do this," he said. It was the first time he'd said anything like it, and it landed in her chest somewhere strange. She kept her eyes on the window. "Yes, I do," she said. "So do you, Pa. We both know that." He didn't argue. The debt was real, and the farm was real, and the alternative was losing both. And Mabel was not the kind of person who pretended that hard things had easy exits. They walked to the church together in the early cold. The wind came in off the mountains with its particular September cruelty, and Mabel kept her chin up and her hands folded in front of her and did not let herself think too hard about what came next. The letter hit the church steps as Garrett's carriage rolled past. She read it. She folded it. She kept moving. There were perhaps 40 people in the church. Copper Ridge was small, and weddings drew everyone regardless of whether they'd been invited, because a wedding was entertainment, and this one in particular was the kind people had been discussing for weeks. Mabel Dawson, the Dawson girl, the big girl, marrying Ethan Callahan. Possible reasons people had invented ranged from absurd to insulting. She'd heard 3 different versions before she stopped listening. She did not look at the crowd when she walked in. She looked at the man standing at the front of the church. Ethan Callahan was tall, and that was the first thing you noticed. Broad through the shoulders from years of real work, not decorative labor, the kind of build that comes from lifting and hauling and doing things yourself even when you could afford not to. He was somewhere around 40, dark-haired, going gray at the temples, with a face that had spent too much time in sun and weather to be considered conventionally handsome and had ended up interesting instead. He was wearing a dark coat that fit him properly, which meant it was probably his own and not borrowed. And he held his hat in both hands in front of him with the careful stillness of a man working very hard to appear calm. He watched her walk toward him. She couldn't read his expression. She'd been trying, from a distance, and she couldn't get there. She'd been expecting disappointment, the particular kind that men wear when a thing is not what they hoped or worse. The smooth blankness of someone who has already stopped seeing you as a person. She'd been braced for both. What she found instead was something quieter, a watchfulness, like he was paying attention in a way that most people in this room were not. She reached the front of the church and stood beside him, and neither of them spoke. The minister began. Behind her, the town of Copper Ridge watched and whispered and waited for something to go wrong. At the moment of vows, Mabel heard a sound from the back of the church, a half-suppressed laugh, quickly swallowed, but not quite quickly enough. She felt it land on her shoulders like a weight. She felt the dress pulling at her waist. She felt everything she had ever been told about herself rise up in the back of her throat, like something she was about to have to swallow down. The minister asked Ethan if he accepted this woman. There was a pause. It wasn't long, 2 seconds, maybe 3, But in those 2 seconds, Mabel felt the entire room lean forward. "I will," Ethan said, not performed, not announced. Quiet and direct, in the tone of a man answering a question he'd already considered. He turned slightly and looked at her when he said it. Not at the minister, not at the room. The minister moved on. Mabel answered her own vows in a voice that didn't shake, which she considered a genuine personal achievement. When it was done, when the minister said the words that made it official, there was polite applause and something else underneath it, the particular sound of a crowd that has been denied the spectacle it came for. Mabel heard it. She suspected Ethan heard it too. Outside the church, in the cold morning air, 2 women who had known Mabel since childhood stood close enough that she could hear them without trying. "I don't understand what he's getting out of it," one said. "Garrett arranged it," the other said. "That's all you need to know. It's some kind of favor or deal, or she must have something on him. Some family connection, or... Please, look at her. Nobody marries that unless they have to." Mabel kept her face forward. Ethan, who had been 3 feet away speaking to the minister, appeared at her side. She didn't know if he'd heard. She didn't ask. His wagon was waiting at the edge of the church grounds, a good wagon. Not showy, the practical kind that does actual work. He offered her his hand to help her up. She took it because the step was high and the dress was limiting, and this was not the moment to prove a point about self-sufficiency. His hand was rough and warm, and he let go the moment she was settled. They drove out of Copper Ridge without speaking. The mountains were ahead of them, catching the early light. Mabel sat with her hands in her lap and her back straight and thought about the folded letter still pressed in her palm, and about her father standing alone outside the church, and about the word will and the way Ethan had said it, and she could not make it all resolve into something she understood. After a mile, Ethan spoke. "You don't have to pretend anything with me," he said. He kept his eyes on the road. "Not today. Not any day." She looked at him. "I don't know what that means." "It means..." He stopped, seemed to search for words that weren't easy. "It means what I said." Mabel turned back to the road. The mountains got closer. The wind was sharp and cold, and the sky had gone the color of washed-out linen. And somewhere behind them, Copper Ridge was already talking. "Why did you agree to this?" she asked. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. "Then same reason you did, I expect," she almost said. "I doubt that." She kept it behind her teeth. They rode the rest of the way without speaking, and it was not an entirely uncomfortable silence, and that surprised her more than any other thing that had happened today. She was a woman who had built her whole life around not needing anyone to fill the quiet. She had not expected to find another person who seemed to understand that. The ranch appeared over the last ridge, like something out of a painting, not because it was grand, although it was, but because it looked used, lived in. The main house was large but not ornate. The outbuildings were practical and well-maintained, and the land rolled out around it in all directions with the specific authority of acreage that has been worked for a long time. Mabel looked at it and felt something she hadn't expected, the faint, dangerous stirring of wanting something. She pushed it down. It was too early for wanting. She was here because of a debt and a letter she was still holding in her fist, and a father who hadn't asked her. Whatever this was, it wasn't hers yet. She didn't know if it ever would be. She had gotten through the wedding. She had not cried in front of Garrett Holloway. She had not stumbled on the steps. She had said her vows in a voice that didn't shake. For now, that was enough. For now, that was everything. She climbed down from the wagon, without waiting for help, and stood in the yard of Ethan Callahan's ranch, and felt the cold wind hit her face and thought, all right, next. Whatever it was, she would move toward it, before she had time to feel the weight. That was the only way she had ever known how to survive. The ranch house was bigger than any place Mabel had ever lived, and that first night she felt every square foot of the difference. Ethan had shown her through the main rooms without ceremony, the kitchen, the sitting room, the hallway that led toward the back, and she had followed and nodded and made note of where things were the way. She always made note of practical information, because practical information was what kept you upright when feelings threatened to knock you sideways. There was a wood stove in the kitchen that was well made and well used. There were shelves with actual books on them, not just one or two, but several rows, which surprised her. There was a long table in the dining room that could seat 8 people and currently seated none, and it had the look of furniture that had been purchased for a life that hadn't quite arrived yet. He stopped at a door near the end of the upstairs hallway. "This would be your room," he said. "There's a lock on the inside. I had it put in last week." She looked at him. "I want you to feel like you can close the door," he said. He wasn't looking at her. Directly, he was looking at the door, or past it, in the way of a man who has prepared something to say and finds the saying of it more difficult than the preparation. "Whatever arrangement this is, you shouldn't feel like you can't." He stopped, started again. "The lock is there if you want it. That's all." Mabel looked at the door, then at him. "Thank you," she said, and meant it more precisely than she'd meant almost anything she'd said that day. He left her alone after that. She heard him go back downstairs, heard the kitchen sounds of a man making himself busy, and she went into the room and sat on the edge of the bed and let herself do the thing she hadn't allowed. All day she let herself feel the full weight of what had happened. It wasn't grief exactly. It wasn't terror. It was something more complicated, something that didn't have a clean name. But she was in a stranger's house. She was his wife. She had agreed to this because there had been no real alternative, and she had known there was no real alternative because she was Mabel Dawson, and this was how her life had always worked. The options available to her were always narrower than the ones available to women the town considered worth more. She'd accepted that. She'd built something out of it, even, a kind of toughness that she genuinely valued. But sitting on this bed in this too large room, she felt the cost of all that toughness in a way she rarely let herself notice. Opened her fist and looked at Garrett Holloway's letter. Then she folded it twice more and set it on the bedside table and lay back on top of the covers and stared at the ceiling until she fell asleep, still in Clara Finch's borrowed dress. She woke at 4:30, same as always. Old habit. The farm didn't care about your feelings, and neither did your body once you'd trained it long enough. She changed into her own clothes. She'd brought 2 dresses and a set of work clothes and a few other things in a bag that now sat in the corner and represented the full sum of what she'd brought to this marriage, and went downstairs to find the kitchen already lit. Ethan was there. He startled slightly when she came in, which told her he hadn't expected her up at this hour. He was standing at the stove with a coffee pot in his hand, and the expression of a man interrupted in a private moment. "I can go back up," she said. "No, please." He moved to get another cup. Didn't think. "Farm habit," she said. "I've been up at this hour since I was 12. Poured her coffee and slid it across the table without making a production of it. She sat down and drank it, and they were quiet for a minute, which was its own kind of information. 2 people who could share a silence without filling it with noise were either deeply comfortable or deeply exhausted. They were probably both. "I was going to check the north fence line this morning," he said. "One of the hands said there's a section that came loose. You don't have to." He paused. "You can do whatever you want. You don't have any obligations about." "Can I come?" she said. He looked at her over his cup. "To check the fence?" "I grew up on a farm," she said. "I know what a fence line looks like." He considered this all right, he said, and that was that. They went out in the cold gray of pre-dawn, Ethan carrying tools and Mabel carrying an extra coil of wire he'd handed her without commentary, and they walked the north fence line while the sky went from black to gray to the particular pale orange that comes just before full light. He found the section that had pulled loose from the post, not a small break, a 6-foot span that had folded inward, and he started working on it, and she watched how he worked before she said anything. Because watching how a person does a practical task tells you more about them than an hour of conversation. He was careful. Not slow, he clearly knew what he was doing, but careful in the sense of taking time to do it right rather than fast. He checked the post before he reset the wire, making sure the issue wasn't deeper than it looked. He was the kind of man who looked for the actual problem rather than just the visible symptom. Post is solid, he said, half to himself. Just the wire. The tension's off on this whole side, Mabel said. He looked up at her. She nodded along the fence line. It's sagging about 3 inches lower than it should be for the next 40 feet. If you just fix this break, it'll come loose again in the same place inside of 2 weeks because the whole section's carrying uneven load. He stood up and looked where she was indicating. He walked the section, testing the wire with his hand every few feet. She watched him figure out she was right. You learned that on your father's farm? He said. The hard way, she said. Fixed the same break 4 times one winter before I figured out what was actually causing it. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read. Then he went back to the toolbox. We'll need to pull the tension on this whole span. I figured, she said. They worked together for 2 hours. He didn't explain things she already knew, and she didn't pretend ignorance to make him feel useful. And by the time they were done, the fence line was properly reset for 40 feet, and the sun was fully up, and Mabel's hands were cold, and she was, to her own surprise, not unhappy. That was the first morning. There were others. The rhythm of the ranch established itself over the following 2 weeks in the way that routines do not by plan but by repetition. Mabel rose early. Ethan rose early. They had coffee. They went separate directions for the morning work and came back together at midday and ate whatever she'd started before she went out, or whatever the cook, a weathered woman named Agnes who had worked there for a decade, had prepared. Agnes was not warm, but she was fair, and she watched Mabel with the careful assessment of someone who has learned not to trust newcomers until newcomers have proven themselves worth trusting. Mabel understood this. She didn't try to be liked. She just did the work that was in front of her. The ranch ran on a system that was functional, but not efficient. Mabel saw it within the first week, not dramatically wrong, not broken, but carrying the particular kind of waste that accumulates when no one has had the time or the outside perspective to notice it. The cattle rotation schedule was leaving certain pastures overgrazed while others sat underused. The supply ordering was done by habit rather than by tracking actual consumption, which meant they were overstocked on some things and chronically short on others. The hands there, were 5 of them, ranging from competent to excellent, were being used in ways that didn't match their actual skills, which meant things got done, but not always by the right people. She didn't say anything, not yet. She wasn't sure what her role was, and she had enough self-knowledge to know that walking into someone's operation and announcing its flaws was not a strategy with a strong track record. Instead, she watched. She asked questions that she framed as curiosity. She talked to the hands when they were willing to talk. Not all of them were. At first, because she was new and a woman, and some of them had opinions about both, and she listened more than she spoke. The one who talked most freely was a hand named Cal Reedy, who was somewhere around 50 and had been on the Callahan ranch for 11 years, and had the particular verbal openness of a man who had worked in isolation long enough that conversation had become a kind of release valve. Cal found her in the barn one afternoon. While she was looking over the supply ledger, she'd asked Agnes if she could borrow. He leaned against the stall door and watched her for a moment. "You're doing inventory?" "Trying to understand the system," she said. "What system?" he said, which was not exactly a question. She looked up. "That's useful information," he laughed. A real laugh, not polite. "Lady, I've been ordering the same number of salt blocks every month for 3 years. Because that's what we ordered the month I started, and nobody ever changed it. We had 40 extra last spring. I put them in the back of the storage shed. Still there? Probably. Unless mice figured out a use for them." She looked back at the ledger. "What else has been running like that?" He was quiet for a second, as if deciding something. Then he said, "How much time do you have?" She put the ledger on the rail in front of her. All afternoon. Cal talked for the better part of 2 hours. Not complaining, he was careful to be clear. He respected Ethan and thought well of the operation generally, but with the relief of a person who has had observations stacking up for years and finally found someone willing to receive them. Pasture rotation issue she'd already noticed. He confirmed the supply problem. He told her about the eastern well that had been running shallow since July, and that someone needed to dig deeper, but the hands didn't have time, and Ethan kept meaning to bring someone in, and it kept not happening. He told her about the relationship between two of the other hands that had soured 6 months ago over something nobody would talk about directly, but which was affecting how the morning work got divided up. "Why haven't you told Callahan any of this?" she asked. Cal looked at her steadily. "I've told him some. He's a good man and he listens. But he's also been running this place alone for a long time, and there's only so many hours in the day. Some things just fall through." She thought about that for a day before she said anything to Ethan. She chose the right moment, not dinner, which had its own awkward formality, but the end of an evening when he was going over papers at the kitchen table and she came down for water. And he looked up and something in his expression was tired in a specific way. "Can I show you something?" she said. He put down his pen. "All right." She spread out the notes she'd made over the week and a half, not a dramatic presentation, just organized observations on paper, the way her mother had taught her to think through problems. She walked him through the supply discrepancy, the pasture situation, the well. She was careful to present it as information rather than criticism, because criticism of a man's own operation is a thing you have to earn the right to offer. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Cal talked to you," he said. "He had observations. He's been here longer than anyone. I know he has opinions." Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. "Some of this I knew. Some I didn't. The well I knew." "I've just been busy," she said. "Stretched," he said, which was a more honest word. "The pasture rotation is the most urgent," she said. "You're going to lose ground productivity on the east side by spring if it doesn't change. Ply issue is just money, but it's consistent money going sideways every month." He looked at her notes again. "How did you learn to think like this?" She wasn't sure what he meant. "Like what?" "Systematically," he said. "Most people look at a problem and see the surface of it. My father's farm failed slowly," she said. "I watched it happen over years. You learn what the early signs look like." Something shifted in his face at that, not pity, which she would have hated, but something more like recognition. Like a man who has also watched something fail slowly and knows what that education costs. "All right," he said. "Show me what you change about the rotation." She pulled the paper closer, and they bent over it together at the kitchen table and talked for an hour about land and cattle and water and the particular mathematics of running an operation that has to survive not just this season, but the next one and the one after that. She forgot for a while that she was a woman in a borrowed situation. She was just a person who understood something and was being asked to explain it, and it was the most comfortable she'd felt since she arrived. She didn't notice until she was back upstairs that Ethan had, at some point during that hour, stopped calling her Mrs. Callahan and started calling her Mabel. The first time she went into town after the wedding was 2.5 weeks later, on a Thursday, because Ethan needed supplies that Agnes couldn't get from the traveling merchant, and Mabel said she'd go. She knew what was coming. She'd grown up in Copper Ridge. She knew exactly how it worked. She went anyway. She drove the wagon herself because she was capable of driving a wagon, and she wasn't going to perform helplessness to make people more comfortable. She went to the general store and nodded to Henry Ware behind the counter, who looked at her with the particular expression of a man recalibrating something, and she gave him the list and waited while he pulled the items. 3 women came in while she was waiting. She recognized all of them: Ruth Meacham, Sylvia Porter, and a younger woman named Dina Hollis, who had been a year behind Mabel in school and had always been kind in public and cutting in private, which was its own kind of skill. They saw her. There was the small, unmistakable hesitation that happens when people are deciding how to play a situation. Ruth smiled. "Mabel, my goodness, I didn't expect to see you here." "I expect you'll keep seeing me," Mabel said pleasantly. "This is my town, too." That landed somewhere. Ruth's smile adjusted slightly. "How are you finding ranch life?" Sylvia asked, with the tone of someone asking a question so they expect to reveal something embarrassing. Interesting, Mabel said. There's a lot to manage. I've been working on the supply system and the pasture rotation schedule. Woke. It's more complex than it looks from the outside. There was a brief silence during which all three women processed that Mabel was talking about the workings of the ranch with the ease of someone who was actually involved in running it, which was not what they had expected. Well, Ruth said finally, that's very industrious of you. I come from a farming family, Mabel said. It's not a new skill. She paid for her supplies. She loaded them into the wagon herself. Drove back to the ranch and did not think about the conversation until after dinner, when she was sitting alone on the porch in the cold, because sometimes you needed the cold to think clearly. She was not fooling herself. The talk in Copper Ridge hadn't changed. The opinions hadn't changed. She'd seen the way Henry Ware's eyes moved over her when she came in, taking stock of the dress, the weight, the borrowed status, all of it processed in 2 seconds. In the way that people who have made up their minds do their processing. She'd seen the calculation in Ruth Meacham's smile. She knew what they said when she left, but something small had happened in that exchange. She had not been diminished by it. She had stood in the general store and talked about pasture rotation, and she had not apologized for being there, and she had not made herself smaller, and the women had not known quite what to do with that. It wasn't victory. It wasn't even close to victory, but it was something she could build on. That was the other thing she'd learned in the 3 weeks since arriving at the Callahan ranch, that building things was possible here, that there was something to build. The ranch had room. Ethan had room in the sense of being a person who hadn't yet decided what he was or wasn't going to become, which was rarer than it sounded in a man of his age and position. She was starting to see that the situation she'd walked into, which had looked from the outside like a dead-end trade, had some quality of openness in it that she didn't yet know what to do with. She wasn't ready to call it hope. That word felt dangerous. But she was thinking about spring planting. She'd noticed a stretch of fallow ground south of the barn that got good light and had decent soil, the kind of soil that had been left alone long enough to recover. She'd been wondering, in the abstract way she let herself wonder about things before she'd earned the right to pursue them, what it would take to put in a kitchen garden. Not decorative, a real one. The kind that fed a household through winter. She hadn't mentioned it yet. She would eventually, when the moment was right. She was learning to read the moments. 4 weeks into the marriage, something happened that she hadn't anticipated. She was in the barn, going over the new supply ledger. She'd started keeping a parallel one, more detailed, to track what was actually being consumed versus what was being ordered when she heard raised voices from the yard. She set down the ledger and went to the barn door. 2 of the hands, a young man named Drew and the older one, a man called Hatch, were squared off near the water trough. It wasn't at the point of violence, not quite, but it had the shape of something that had been building for a while and had finally found a moment to crack open. She couldn't hear the exact words from this distance, but the posture was clear enough. She looked around for Ethan. He was across the property, she knew, checking on a heifer that had been off feed for 2 days. He wouldn't be back for another hour at least. She stood in the barn door for a moment. Then she walked out into the yard. "Drew," she said. Her voice came out steady and level, which she appreciated. "I need you to pull the wagon around and check up the left rear wheel. There was a noise on the way back from town that I want someone to look at." Drew looked at her. The interruption had punctured something, and he was trying to find his way back to the anger, and discovering it was harder now that a third person was present. "Now," he said. "Please," she said. He went. Not happily, but he went. She looked at Hatch, who was watching her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. "East pasture water trough needs cleaning," she said. "It's been 2 weeks. That's not my—" "I know," she said. "It's mine, technically, but I'd rather not do it myself if you're available." He stared at her for a long moment. Then he picked up a bucket and walked toward the east pasture without another word. She went back to the barn and picked up her ledger. Her hands were not entirely steady. She stood with the ledger in her lap and breathed and reminded herself that she had not done anything remarkable. She had just interrupted two men before they did something stupid, which required no particular authority, only willingness. Cal appeared in the barn door 20 minutes later. He looked at her and she looked at him. "That's been building for 6 weeks," he said. "Figured," she said. "Ethan's going to want to know about it." "Yes," she said. "I'll tell him tonight." Cal leaned in the doorway for a moment. "Not everyone's going to come around," he said. It wasn't a warning exactly, more like an offering of information. She has been here 8 years. He doesn't like change. He especially doesn't like women, she said. "Women making decisions," Cal said, which was more specific and therefore more useful. "I know," she said. "I grew up here." She did tell Ethan that evening. He listened without surprise, which meant he'd known something had been off between those two and hadn't quite found the time to address it. Thanked her. She told him not to thank her, that she'd done it because it was the practical thing, and she'd been standing right there. And he looked at her for a moment with an expression she was starting to recognize, like something was adjusting, behind his eyes, some assessment being quietly revised. "You've been good for this place," he said. She was unprepared for that. She looked at her plate. "It's only been a month." "I know," he said. "I'm aware of how long it's been." There was something in that she didn't know how to respond to. So she changed the subject and asked about the heifer, and he told her the heifer was probably going to be fine. And they finished dinner talking about cattle. And it was almost possible to forget that this time a month ago they were strangers, standing at an altar while the town of Copper Ridge waited for something to go wrong. The Thursday market came around again, and this time Ethan said he'd come into town with her. She didn't ask why. She suspected he'd heard something. He had a way of knowing things that happened in Copper Ridge without appearing to seek out the information, but she didn't press it. Drove in together, side by side on the wagon seat, which was the first time they'd done it since the wedding day, and it felt different now than it had then. Then they had been strangers executing an arrangement. Now they were. She wasn't sure what they were. Not strangers, that much was clear. Something without a clean name. Same as that feeling her first night in the room, with the lock on the door. The market was busy. Thursday market drew most of the town. She felt the eyes before she saw them, that particular quality of attention that a place gives to something it considers worth watching. Kept her chin up. Old habit. Garrett Holloway was there. She saw him before he saw her, which gave her 2 seconds to decide how to hold her face. He was standing near the dry goods booth, with 2 other men, one of whom she recognized as his lawyer Sinclair. He was dressed well, as always, and talking with his hands, as always, and he had the look of a man fully satisfied with his position in the world. Then he saw her. The expression that crossed his face was complicated, not what she expected, which would have been dismissal or amusement. It was something more cautious, as if she had become, in the weeks since the wedding, a variable he hadn't accounted for. Ethan was at her side. She felt his presence there, not protective. Exactly. Or not only protective, more like deliberate, like he had chosen where to stand. Garrett smiled the performance of a smile, the kind that doesn't make it to the eyes. "Mabel," he said. Then to Ethan Callahan, "How's married life treating you?" "Fine," Ethan said. One word. He didn't extend the conversation. Garrett's eyes moved to Mabel. "You look well," he said, with a particular intonation that made the compliment into something else, a reminder that he had the power to appraise her, to find her wanting or not wanting, according to his own scale. "Thank you," she said. Her voice didn't give him anything. "I trust the farm debt has been settled satisfactorily," he said. "It has," she said. "My father has his land. We're all very grateful for your generosity." The word generosity in her mouth, with that particular flatness, landed exactly where she meant it to land. Garrett's eyes sharpened slightly. "Anything you need," he said from the valley. "I'm always available to assist." "We're managing well," Ethan said. Still one sentence. Still no opening. They moved on. She didn't look back. They were halfway across the market when Ethan said quietly, "You handled that well. I've been handling things like that my whole life," she said, and the flatness in her own voice surprised her, not bitterness. "Exactly. but the sound of something that had been carried a long time and was finally getting tired. Ethan didn't say anything, but he walked slower, which put him closer to her side for the rest of the time they were in the market, and she didn't think it was accidental. So, on the drive back, as the mountains caught the afternoon light, he said, "Garrett arranged the marriage." "I know," she said. "You know what people think that means. I know what people say it means." He was quiet for a moment. "What do you think it means?" She looked at the road ahead. The answer to that question had been changing on her for several weeks, which was something she hadn't quite admitted to herself until this moment, and she wasn't ready to say all of it out loud. "I think," she said carefully, "that I don't have enough information yet." He nodded, turned his eyes back to the road. "That's fair," he said. And he sounded like he meant it, not disappointed, not pushing, just receiving the information she'd given him and not demanding more. She looked at the mountains and thought about the letter in Garrett Holloway's hand that had landed on the church steps, and she thought about the kitchen table and the fence line and the ledger in the barn. And she thought about the word will and what it could mean when a man said it quietly without performing it for a room. She didn't have a conclusion. She wasn't a person who forced conclusions before they were ready. But the ground under her feet felt more solid than it had a month ago. That was not nothing. In her life, that had often been everything. Kitchen garden happened in October. Mabel had waited 6 weeks before bringing it up, which she later thought was probably 2 weeks longer than necessary. But she had been calibrating, learning the difference between what was hers to decide and what required asking, and finding that line harder to draw than she'd expected in a situation that had no clear rule book. She brought it up one morning while they were having coffee, set her cup down and said, "That stretch of ground south of the barn. What was it used for?" Ethan looked up. "Nothing for years. My first wife had plans for it. Never happened." He said it without evasion, which she respected. She'd known he'd been married. Before, the house had the quality of a place where someone's absence had settled into the walls, but he hadn't volunteered the information, and she hadn't asked. She still didn't ask. What she said was, "I'd like to put in a kitchen garden there. A real one, not decorative. If that's all right." He looked at her for a moment. "What do you need?" "Lumber for raised beds. Seed if there's any left in the store. About a week of mornings. Take Cal for the heavy work." "I can manage the Mabel." He said her name like a period at the end of a sentence. "Take Cal." She took Cal. They built 4 raised beds against the south wall of the barn where the light was best and the wind broke against the wood. Cal was better with lumber than she'd expected, and she told him so, and he said he'd built half the fencing on the property over the years and had opinions about which wood held and which didn't. They worked together without difficulty, which was something she'd learned to notice and value, the specific ease of working beside a person who didn't need to establish superiority before they could be useful. She planted what would winter over and planned for what she'd start in spring. Garlic and onion sets, cold-tolerant greens, root vegetables that would sit in the ground through frost and come out sweeter for it. She was on her knees in the dirt, with her sleeves rolled up, when Agnes came out of the back door of the house and stood watching with her arms folded. Mabel looked up. "Something wrong?" "Nothing wrong," Agnes said. She had a way of making neutral statements sound like assessments. "Came to ask about onions. We go through more than you'd think." "I put in 2 rows," Mabel said. "Come spring, I'll do 4. Agnes looked at the beds. She looked at Mabel. She went back inside. It was not effusive, but it was something. The change in Agnes happened slowly and was never announced. Over the following weeks, the cook began appearing in the doorway of whatever room Mabel was working in, not intruding, just present. She had been running the kitchen and the household accounts for a decade, and she knew where everything was and why. And Mabel came to understand, been carrying a significant portion of the ranch's domestic organization entirely alone because there had been no one to share it with. She began asking Mabel's opinion on things, not deferring, but consulting, the way 2 capable people consult each other when they have different but complementary knowledge. Mabel asked Agnes about the household, spending the same way she'd asked Cal about the supply situation. And Agnes told her more than Mabel had expected, and they spent 2 evenings going over the household accounts together and found 3 places where money was being spent by habit rather than by need. Ethan noticed. He didn't comment on it directly, but she caught him watching the two of them one evening with an expression that had some quality of relief in it, like a man who had not realized how much weight he'd been carrying until some of it was redistributed. The ranch was a living thing, and she was learning its rhythms. That was how she thought of it, not as something she was taking over or remaking, but as something she was beginning to understand from the inside. There was a difference. She held on to the difference carefully. The letter from Garrett Holloway arrived on a Tuesday in early November. It was addressed to Ethan, and she did not open it, but she was in the kitchen when Ethan read it, and she saw what happened to his face. He had a controlled face. In general, she'd been studying it long enough now to know the difference between his neutral expression and the effort required to maintain it, and what she saw when he read that letter was the effort. The specific tightening around his jaw that meant something had landed that required management. He folded it and set it on the table without speaking. She waited. "Garrett's requesting a meeting," he said, "about the eastern boundary. What about it?" He was quiet for a moment. "There's been a question about where my land ends and the Holloway holdings begin. On the eastern side, near the creek. It came up 8 years ago and was settled. Or, I thought it was settled. It appears Garrett has decided it should come up again." She looked at him steadily. "Why now?" He picked up the letter again, looked at it without reading it, because now is a good time for him. "The water table's down. Creek is more valuable than it was. And I'm occupied." The last word he said, with a particular flatness that she understood. He was occupied. He had taken on a new wife and restructured his domestic situation and spent the last several weeks integrating those changes. And Garrett Holloway had looked at all of that and seen a window. "Do you have documentation of the boundary settlement?" she asked. "Somewhere. I'd have to find it." "Then find it," she said. Before the meeting, he looked at her. "I intended to." "I know," she said. "I'm just saying, find it first, before anything else." He nodded slowly. She could see him working through it, the implications of Garrett making this move now, what it meant, what it would require. She could also see the fatigue behind the working through, the particular tiredness of a man who had been managing things alone for a long time, and had not quite finished adjusting to the fact that he didn't have to manage everything alone anymore. She didn't push. She let him think. That evening he came to her with a wooden box of documents that had been in the back of the office, and they spread them across the kitchen table and looked through them together. The boundary survey was there, dated 8 years ago, signed by 2 surveyors and a county official. Clear. The creek ran through Callahan land for its full length along the eastern boundary. There was no ambiguity. "He knows this exists," Mabel said. "Yes," Ethan said. "So what does he actually want?" Ethan sat back. He looked at the document for a long moment. "To establish that he can make things complicated. That's usually what Garrett wants. The specific thing, the land, the water rights, that's real. He'd take it if he could get it. But the message he's sending is that he can make my life difficult whenever he decides to." Why would he want to send that message? He looked at her. "Because I'm not entirely sure the arrangement he set up for our marriage went the way he expected." She held his gaze. What did he expect? Someone quieter, I think. He said it without embellishment. Just set it down on the table between them like another document. Someone who would come in and not change anything. He told me, when he proposed the arrangement, that it would be a manageable situation. That was the word he used. Manageable. The word sat in her chest in a particular way. Manageable. She had been described many ways in her life, but that one had its own specific flavor. "He was wrong," she said. "Clearly," Ethan said, and the edge of something moved across his face that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the same neighborhood. She looked at the boundary survey. "Take the meeting. Bring the documentation." "I wasn't going to offer anything." "Good. And take Sinclair, your own lawyer. Not whoever Garrett brings." He paused. I have a lawyer in Millbrook. I haven't needed him in a while. You need him now, she said. He nodded. He gathered the documents back into the box with the care of a man handling something he intended to use. She watched him and thought about the word manageable, and about the letter on the church steps, and about the fact that Garrett Holloway had looked at her and seen a piece that could be moved around a board. She had grown up watching men, like him, men who viewed the world in terms of what they could leverage and what they couldn't, who calculated other people's worth in terms of their utility and their tractability. She had been leveraged. She did not intend to be tractable. The meeting with Garrett happened the following week in the offices of a neutral party, a land broker in the county seat named Aldrich, who had a large desk, and the weary expression of a man who had seen too many of these conversations to find them interesting. Ethan brought his lawyer, a spare, deliberate man named Court, whom Mabel liked immediately for the quality of his silence. He did not fill space with words. He listened first and spoke second, which in her experience was how useful people operated. Mabel had asked to come. Ethan had considered it for a day before saying yes. Garrett had not expected her. She saw it in his face when they walked. In the brief flicker of surprise quickly managed. He was with Sinclair and one other man she didn't recognize, and he recovered smoothly and extended his hand to Ethan and nodded to Mabel with the particular courtesy that men like Garrett performed for women they didn't take seriously. Mabel, he said, I didn't realize this would be a family occasion. She has an interest in the ranch's business, Ethan said. She's welcome to be here. Garrett's eyes moved to her once more, reassessing. Then he turned to the table and began. The argument he made was elaborately constructed and required about 15 minutes to present. Sinclair had prepared materials a different survey, older, with different lines, which Garrett claimed predated the settlement and therefore superseded it. He spoke about water rights and seasonal flow and the evolution of the creek's path over the decades. He was persuasive in the way that men who have practice at being persuasive are persuasive not because the argument was strong, but because the presentation of it was confident and detailed. When he finished, Court set the original boundary survey on the table. This is dated, he said. It postdates the document you're citing. It was signed by both parties and filed with the county. Garrett looked at it. Sinclair looked at it. There may be a question about the filing, Sinclair said. There isn't, Court said. He produced the county filing receipt, corded. October 14th, 8 years ago. The room was quiet. Mabel had been watching Garrett during this exchange. She'd been watching the way his certainty adjusted, not collapsed. Men like Garrett didn't collapse in rooms like this, but recalibrated. He had come in holding most of the cards and was discovering that 2 of the key ones had already been played. There may be other approaches to this question, Garrett said. His tone had shifted still smooth, but in a different register now, negotiating rather than claiming. The water rights on the eastern section are something the whole valley has an interest in, perhaps a shared management arrangement. No, Ethan said. One word. Same as at the market. Garrett looked at him. Creek runs through my land, Ethan said. That's been established. I manage it as I see fit. Callahan, we're done with this, Ethan said. He said it without raising his voice, which made it more final than shouting would have. They left the meeting and drove back to the ranch, and Mabel did not say much for the first mile because she was processing what she'd seen. And what she'd seen was Ethan Callahan in a room with a powerful man who had expected to get something from him and had gotten nothing. She'd watched him hold his ground without performance, without aggression, without giving Garrett anything to use. It was, she thought, the most she had understood about who he was in all the weeks she'd known him. He'll try something else, she said. Yes, Ethan said. He usually does. Does that worry you? He thought about it honestly, which she'd come to appreciate he didn't give automatic answers. Less than it used to, he said. She let that sit and didn't ask what had changed, because she thought she knew, and saying it aloud felt like too much of something she wasn't ready to name. November moved into December with the particular severity that the mountains enforced. The cold was real and daily and demanded attention pipes to be watched, animals to be checked, firewood to be moved closer as the stacks diminished. Mabel had grown up in cold, but the ranch operated on a larger scale than the Dawson farm had, and the logistics of it were different, and she spent most of December learning those logistics by doing them. She visited her father twice that month. He was living more comfortably, the debt erased, the farm released from its most immediate pressure, but he had the look of a man who had been holding a terrible thing for so long that its absence left him uncertain what to do with his hands. She sat with him and drank his bad coffee and listened to him talk about the acreage he was planning to plant in spring. And she didn't mention the arrangement, and he didn't either. Some things were true and didn't need to be discussed. On the second visit, he said, "Is he good to you?" She thought about it in the particular way. She thought about things that deserved actual consideration. "Yes," she said, "that's not nothing." "No," she said, "it's not." She drove back to the ranch in the early dark of December afternoon and thought about what good to you meant and how long she'd lived without being able to use it as a description of her situation, and felt something in her chest that was unfamiliar and slightly frightening in the way that unfamiliar things are when they're good rather than bad. The town harvest social came on a Friday evening in the second week of December, which was, Mabel thought, an optimistic use of the word harvest, given that the harvest had concluded 6 weeks ago. Copper Ridge held the social in December because the harvest itself was too busy for socializing, and everyone needed something to look forward to in the cold months. It was held in the grain exchange hall, which was large enough for most of the town, and attendance was expected from anyone who had any social standing, which now apparently included Mabel. She did not particularly want to go. She said so to Ethan, who said, "We don't have to," with a readiness that told her he also didn't particularly want to go. "But we should," she said. "Probably," he said. They went. The grain exchange was warm and loud, in the way that these events always were. Lanterns hung from the beams, the smell of wood smoke and food, and too many people in one space, particular music of a fiddle player who was enthusiastic if not entirely precise. Mabel wore her better dress, which was still not the best dress in the room, but was hers and fit her properly, because she'd made it herself 2 years ago. She'd stopped apologizing to herself for what she looked like. That particular battle had been going on since she was 14, and she had run out of energy for it. They were greeted at the door by Henry Ware and his wife, who were functioning as informal hosts. Henry's wife, Paulette, was a woman of genuine warmth, whose goodwill Mabel had always trusted precisely because it didn't seem to require anything in return. Paulette took both Mabel's hands and said, "You look wonderful, truly," and managed to make it sound like an observation rather than a conclusion. The room received them in layers. Some people greeted them warmly. Court was there with his wife and several of the ranching families from the outer valley who Mabel had begun to recognize at the Thursday market, and a woman named Harriet Bloom who ran the dry goods booth and had always treated Mabel with uncomplicated respect. Others watched from across the room with the careful attention of people who hadn't decided yet how to recalibrate, and some a smaller group, clustered near the far end of the room, were watching with something less neutral. Ruth Meacham was there, Sylvia Porter. A handful of others Mabel had known her whole life as the particular species of woman who navigates social terrain by establishing hierarchies and then enforcing them. Mabel did not go near that group. She moved through the room and talked to people she had actual things to say to, and ate the food that was very good because Copper Ridge took its potluck seriously, and drank the cider that was very cold because the hall was poorly insulated near the serving tables. She was talking to Harriet Bloom about the spring planting. Harriet had opinions about seed suppliers that turned out to be well-informed when she heard it. Not loud, not intended to carry, probably. But the hall had acoustics that collected certain kinds of sound and sent sideways. Married her because he felt sorry for her. That's all that is. No man in his right mind. It was Sylvia Porter's voice. Mabel recognized it without looking. Look at her, honestly, even dressed up she's still. The second voice she couldn't identify. It didn't matter. Harriet had heard it too. Mabel could tell by the way Harriet's face went careful and deliberate, the way people's faces go when they're deciding how to act in the presence of something that requires a response. Mabel set down her cider cup. She had swallowed things her entire life. She had been swallowing since she was a girl, with a round face and wide hips standing in the schoolyard, while other children found the specific cruelties that stuck. She had swallowed at the general store and at the church and in rooms like this one, and she had called it practical, and she had called it surviving, and she had called it choosing her battles, and all of those things were true, and she was done. She wasn't thinking clearly in those 2 seconds. She knew that. She also knew that there are moments when thinking clearly is a form of cowardice. Turned. Sylvia Porter was 5 feet away, slightly behind her, in conversation with 2 other women. She saw Mabel turn, and something crossed her face. Not guilt. Sylvia Porter wasn't the type, but a recalibration. Bracing. The hall hadn't gone quiet. Not yet. The fiddle was still going. People nearest to them had registered the shift in the air, the specific tension that appears before something happens. Mabel looked at Sylvia Porter and thought about every time she'd made herself smaller to make a room more comfortable. Every time she'd walked away from something she should have answered. Every year she'd let the accumulated weight of other people's opinions shape the outline of her own life. "You said my husband married me because he felt sorry for me," Mabel said. Her voice came out even, not loud. The hall didn't require loud, it had those acoustics. Sylvia's chin came up. "I was having a private conversation." "I heard it," Mabel said. "So now it's not private." Fiddle stopped. Not dramatically. The player had simply reached the end of a verse and paused, and in the coincidental silence, Mabel's voice was very clear. "I don't want to embarrass anyone," Mabel said, which was not entirely true, but was the right thing to say. "I just want to say one thing." She could feel the room now, the weight of 50 people paying attention. She had not prepared a speech. She did not have the organized version of this thought. What she had was the accumulation of 31 years of being told, in ways direct and indirect, small and large, she was worth, and the specific exhaustion of carrying that, and the thing that had been shifting in her since she came to the Callahan ranch and started to understand that worth wasn't assigned by rooms full of people. It was built by your own hands, out of what you did with the time you had. "I spent my whole life being told what I wasn't," she said. "That I was too much of some things and not enough of others. That my body was a problem other people had to manage their feelings about. That a man would have to have a reason to choose me, a reason other than me." The room was very still. "I know what this town thinks about why I'm here. I know what Garrett Holloway wrote on that letter he threw at my feet on my wedding morning." She hadn't planned to say that. Came out anyway. "I know how this looks from the outside. A woman from a family in debt marrying a man who could have had anyone." Stopped. She looked around the room, not at Sylvia, at all of it. "Here is what I know from the inside. I have been on that ranch for 3 months. I have worked every day. I have found problems that were costing money and fixed them. I have managed situations that needed managing. I have built things that will still be useful in 10 years. And I have been treated by my husband like someone whose opinion has value, like someone worth listening to." She looked at Sylvia Porter again. "Whether or not you think I'm worth looking at, Sylvia, I know what I'm worth from the work I do, and I'm done letting other people's version of me be louder than my own." The room was quiet in the specific way that rooms are quiet when something has happened that cannot be taken back. Harriet Bloom started it, a single sound of approval that she didn't bother to suppress. 1 or 2 others followed. It wasn't applause. It wasn't a standing ovation. It was the particular sound of people who had been waiting for something to be said and were relieved that someone had finally said it. Sylvia Porter's face was a complicated map. She said nothing. There was nothing that could be said usefully. Mabel picked up her cider cup. Her hands were steady, which continued to surprise her. Ethan was beside her. She hadn't heard him come across the room, but he was there, not intervening, not putting himself between her and the moment, just present at her shoulder, in the way he'd been present at the market, standing where he'd chosen to stand. He didn't say anything until they were outside, coat on, cold air sharp against her face. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. "You're sure?" She took a breath of cold air. "I'm not sure if that was wise." "Probably wasn't," he said. "But I'm not sorry." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not either." She looked at him in the dark, the lamp from the hall catching the side of his face. "This is going to cause trouble," she said. "People will talk. People were already talking." "More," she said. "Let them," he said, and the simplicity of it, the complete and unperformed absence of concern, landed somewhere in her chest in a way she didn't entirely know what to do with. They drove home in the cold and the dark and the particular silence that follows a thing that has changed something, and somewhere in the middle of the drive she realized. Her hands had finally unclenched. She had been holding herself tightly since the wedding morning. She had been braced, perpetually, against the next blow, the next reduction, the next person with a measuring stick they hadn't been asked to carry. She had been surviving, which was something she was very good at, and which she had always been proud of, but which was not the same as living. The ranch came over the ridge in the dark. Lamplight in one window of the main house, where Agnes had left a light burning, the way she'd started doing when they went out in the evenings. Small habit that nobody had asked for and that nobody commented on. Mabel looked at it. "I need to tell you something," she said. Ethan pulled the horses to a stop in the yard. He looked at her, waiting. That letter Garrett sent. The one on the church steps. She had not told him about it. She'd been carrying it for 3 months. He wrote that he called me the fat girl. Said you married someone desperate. She said it flatly, because the flatness was how she'd survived it. "I want you to know I saw it, and I want you to know it didn't stop me from walking into that church. I just want that to be known." He was still for a long moment. The horses shifted. The cold settled around them. "I'm sorry he did that," Ethan said. "It's not your fault." "No," he said. "But I'm sorry it happened." She nodded. She climbed down from the wagon before he could offer a hand, not because she was being stubborn, but because she needed to be on her own feet for this part. "I don't want to leave," she said. She said it to the yard, to the house with the light in the window, to the specific fact of where she was. "I want you to know that. I know how this started. I know it was a transaction. But I'm not here because of the debt anymore." Could feel him behind her, still on the wagon seat. "I'm here because this is the first place in my life where I've had room to be full-sized," she said. "And I'm not ready to give that up." The cold was complete around them. Somewhere out in the dark, one of the horses blew a breath. Ethan climbed down from the wagon. She heard his boots on the frozen ground. She heard him come up beside her. He didn't touch her, stood beside her, and they both looked at the house with its single window of light. "Room," he said quietly. "There's plenty of it." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. She walked toward the house, and he walked beside her, and the night closed around the ranch the way it always did, complete and cold, and full of the particular silence of land that doesn't care about human stories but holds them anyway, holds all of them, the ones that fail and the ones that don't, with the same steady indifference. But the light was on. That was something. The talk started the morning after the harvest socials and spread through Copper Ridge. The way talk always spread, not all at once but in layers, each person adding their own interpretation until the original event was somewhere underneath several versions of itself. Mabel knew this because Cal told her, not out of gossip, but out of the practical loyalty of a man who had decided which side he was on and thought she deserved accurate information. He found her at the kitchen garden on Saturday morning, where she was turning the beds over for winter and stood at the edge of the boards with his hat in his hands. "People are talking about what happened at the social," he said. "I expected that," she said without looking up. "Some of it's not bad," he said. "Harriet Bloom told 3 people you said something that needed saying. Ed Pruitt from the Northern Valley said the same. There's a version going around where half the room applauded. The room didn't applaud." "No," he said. "But that's the version people like. So that's the one that's spreading." She turned a section of soil and hit a rock she hadn't known was there and had to work it loose. "And the other version?" Cal was quiet for a moment. Ruth Meacham is saying you embarrassed your husband in public. That a wife making a scene at a social event reflects on Callahan's ability to manage his own household. She set down the trowel, looked at him. Manage his household. Her words. Not mine. No, he said, I know that. She picked the trowel back up. The rock came loose and she set it aside. Does Ethan know? Probably. He's been into town this morning. She worked the bed without speaking for a moment. Cal stayed where he was, which she'd come to understand was his way. He delivered information and then waited to see if there was anything useful to do with it. And if there wasn't, he left without making a production of leaving. Thank you, she said. He put his hat back on. Hatch is coming around, by the way. Slowly. Don't say. I said so. She looked up. He was already walking toward the barn. Ethan came back from town in the early afternoon with the particular quietness that meant he was carrying something he was sorting through. She'd learned to read his silences over the months. They had different textures, different weights. This one was the kind that required time before it became conversation, so she didn't press it. She finished the garden work and came inside and washed up and started the midday meal. And by the time she had food on the table, he had come in and sat down and some of the weight had shifted from his face. Ruth Meacham spoke to me at the post office, he said. Cal told me, she said, about the version she's putting around. He looked at her. You're not concerned? I'm not unconcerned, she said. But I'm not going to apologize for what I said. I didn't ask you to. I know. I'm telling you before you have to ask. He picked up his fork, set it back down. Ruth implied that I have no control over my wife's conduct, that a man in my position should be more careful about what he allows. The word allows landed between them like something solid. What did you say? Mabel asked. I said that what my wife chooses to do or not do is her own business and mine, and not Ruth Meacham's. She looked at him across the table. And she told me I'd regret enabling you. He said it without particular emotion, just presenting the information. That's the word she used. Enabling. Mabel absorbed this. She thinks you're making a mistake. Ruth Meacham has thought I was making mistakes for 20 years. I've managed. This is different, is it? He looked at her steadily. She thought I was making a mistake when I didn't sell the eastern pasture to Garrett 6 years ago. She thought I was making a mistake when I let go of the ranch hand, who was stealing from me instead of quietly paying him off. She thinks anything that might cause friction is a mistake because her primary value is the absence of friction. Mabel thought about this. Friction has costs, she said. Everything has costs, he said. I'd rather pay for friction than pay for silence. He picked up his fork again, and this time used it. She looked at her own plate and thought about the word enables, the specific judgment embedded in it, the implication that she was something to be managed, that Ethan's role was to contain her rather than stand beside her. She thought about how long she had lived in a world that thought of her that way, and how recently she had started to understand that the world's framing was not the only available frame. Garrett will use this, she said. Yes. I don't know how yet, but he will. He was going to find something, Ethan said. If it hadn't been the social, it would have been something else. That's how he operates. He looks for what's pressurable. She thought about the boundary meeting, about Garrett's face when he realized the documentation was solid, about the particular quality of a man who had lost one approach and was already identifying the next one. What does he want? She said. Not a question she'd asked it before, but a different version of it. Not the land. Not specifically. What does he actually want from you? Ethan was quiet for long enough that she thought he might deflect. Then he wants what he's always wanted from me. My cooperation. My participation in the way he runs this valley. What does that mean? It means Garrett has built a system, Ethan said carefully, where the significant landowners in this area operate by his rules. You bring your disputes to him. You share your plans with him before you execute them. You treat his preferences as the final word on most things that matter. Some men in this valley do that willingly. Others have been pressured into it. I've spent 12 years not doing it, and he tolerates that because I'm large enough that the cost of forcing the issue is high. But he doesn't like it. And the marriage. The marriage was meant to be a point of entry, Ethan said. Think. I've been working out what he intended. He arranges the match. I'm obligated to him. He can present himself as having done me a favor. And the woman he chose, he stopped. Supposed to be grateful and contained, Mabel finished. Something like that. She looked at her plate. He chose wrong. Did, Ethan said, and there was something in his voice she didn't quite know what to do with, not amusement, not pride exactly, more like the sound of a man who has been surprised by something and found the surprise, upon reflection, to be a good. The second letter from Garrett arrived in January. This one was not addressed to Ethan. It was addressed to Mabel. She opened it at the kitchen table after Ethan had gone out for the morning. She read it twice, which was once more than it deserved, and then set it flat on the table and looked at it. Garrett wrote with the elaborate courtesy that powerful men use when they're issuing warnings. The letter was 3 paragraphs long and discussed. In its first paragraph, how much he admired the spirit Mabel had shown in Copper Ridge, a nod to the social framed as a compliment. The second paragraph discussed the importance of stability to a functioning community, and the particular role that the wives of prominent men played in maintaining that stability, and how a woman in Mabel's position might find her influence growing significantly if she understood how to direct it productively. The third paragraph suggested, in the most gracious possible terms, that Mabel might benefit from a private conversation with Garrett at her earliest convenience to discuss how she could make the most of her new situation. Recruitment letter. Dressed up as friendly advice, but unmistakably a recruitment letter. He was offering her a role in his system, the role of a compliant wife who would be rewarded with social standing in exchange for helping manage Ethan. She folded it into quarters and set it inside the boundary survey box, which she had started thinking of as the documentation box, the place where things that needed to be kept were kept. When Ethan came in, she said, "Garrett wrote to me." He looked at her. "What did he say?" She described the letter without editorializing. He listened with the stillness that meant he was angry and was not going to perform it. "He's trying to split us," he said. "He's trying to recruit me," she said, which is his version of the same thing. "You're not going to respond to it." "I'm not going to respond to it," she confirmed. "But I think we should tell Court." He looked at her for a moment. "Why Court?" "Because Garrett is building a record," she said. The boundary challenge. Now this. He's identifying pressure points and testing them one at a time. Court should know the pattern. Ethan was quiet. "You think he's building to something specific?" "I think he's a man who plans," she said. "And he's been planning around you for a long time." The marriage was supposed to be part of the plan. It didn't go the way he intended, and now he's adjusting. What adjustments concern you most? She thought about it. The water rights question. You beat him on the documentation, but water is going to matter more next summer. If the dry conditions hold, he'll find another angle on it. She hesitated, and I think he'll try something more public. He embarrasses easily. You've beaten him twice now. The boundary meeting, the social especially, because people saw that. You beat him at the social, Ethan said. We were there together, she said. That's how he'll frame it. Ethan sent a letter to Court the next day. She didn't ask what was in it, but he left it on the table before he sealed it, and she understood that as an invitation and read it, and it was a clear and accurate summary of Garrett's pattern of pressure and a request for Court to begin documenting it. She added a paragraph of her own, which she wrote and offered to him before folding it in. It described the recruitment letter in precise terms, including language that she thought a lawyer might find useful. Ethan read her addition and said nothing, and folded it in with his own. That small act, her paragraph, folded in with his, sent as part of the same communication, was not something she analyzed while it was happening. She analyzed it afterward in the quiet of the evening and understood that it was the first time the two of them had operated as something with a single external face. January was hard in the way. January is always hard. The cold absolute, the work unrelenting, the days short and the nights long, and the particular cabin pressure of people spending too much time in too little space. The hands grew irritable. Agnes was short-tempered for a week over something nobody identified. The heifer that had been off-feed in October calved early, and the calf was small and required watching, which meant someone was out in the cold barn every few hours for 6 days until the animal stabilized. Mabel took her share of the barn watches. She did the 3 in the morning one, which was the one nobody wanted, for 3 consecutive nights. Ethan came out the second night and found her there, and said nothing about it, didn't tell her to go back to sleep, didn't offer to take over, just sat down on the other side of the stall with his back against the boards and kept her company. They sat in the cold and watched the small calf breathe and talked about nothing in particular, the pasture plans for spring, the supply order she'd revised. Problem Cal had mentioned with the tool storage that had an obvious solution once you saw it. It was the second or third time she'd registered that conversations with Ethan at odd hours had a quality, that conversations in daylight didn't quite reach less managed, less aware of themselves. At some point he said, "Tell me about your mother." She looked at him across the stall. "Why?" "You don't talk about her. I've noticed. She's been gone 4 years." "I know. You still don't talk about her." She considered this. Calf shifted in the straw and settled. "She was practical," Mabel said finally. "Unsentimental in public. You'd have thought she didn't feel things hard. But she did. She just kept them where they were useful. You take after her." "I used to think that was a criticism," she said. "People said she was cold. She wasn't cold. She just didn't waste feeling." "There's a difference," he said. "A big one." She looked at the calf. "She told me once I was maybe 15, she said that the most important thing a woman could do was know the difference between what she owed other people and what she owed herself. She said most women spent their whole lives confused about that distinction, and it cost them. Was she right?" "Yes," Mabel said. "I just didn't fully understand what she meant until the last few months." He was quiet for a moment. "Then what did she mean, do you think?" Mabel turned the question over. "I think she meant that the world is very good at convincing women that their own needs are selfish, that what they want doesn't count as a real thing. And once you accept that framing, you stop being a person and start being a function. And she didn't want that for me." "Did she manage it herself?" "Partially," Mabel said. "Better than most." "Not perfectly." She paused. "Nobody does it perfectly." He made a sound of agreement that wasn't quite a word. They sat for another few minutes in the quiet of the barn, and then the calf struggled up on its legs and made it 2 steps before sitting back down, which was more than it had managed in the previous days, and they both watched this with the particular satisfaction of people who have put time into something and seen it begin to pay off. "I think she's going to be all right," Mabel said. "I think so too," Ethan said. She went back to the house at 4:30. She lay down on top of her covers the way she'd done on that first wedding night, still in her coat for a while, because she was cold to the bone, and she thought about the barn and the calf and the conversation and the way the last 4 months had accumulated into something she didn't have a word for, but could feel the weight and shape of, the way you can feel a thing in your hands before you've decided what to call it. She was building something. That was the clearest she could get to it. Court's response arrived in the 3rd week of January. He had looked into Garrett Holloway's recent legal activities and found 3 things worth noting. First, Garrett had filed a water rights claim in the county seat, not against Callahan land specifically, but broadly drawn in a way that could be used to argue precedent in future disputes. Second, he had quietly purchased a parcel of land adjacent to the eastern boundary that hadn't been on the market that Court knew of, which suggested a private arrangement. Third, and this was what made Mabel sit down and read the letter, twice, Garrett had made inquiries with 2 county officials about the original Dawson Farm debt settlement, asking detailed questions about the terms in the documentation. "He's looking at your father's debt," Ethan said when she showed him the letter. "Paid it," she said. "He can't." She stopped. Thought, "Can he?" "Not legally. The debt is settled. The documentation is solid." Court checked. Ethan set the letter down. "But he can make questions. He can suggest irregularities that don't exist and require them to be disproved. He can make your father spend money he doesn't have on lawyers. She sat with that. The specific and calculated cruelty of it settled into her understanding of what kind of man Garrett Holloway was, not impulsive, not reactive, but patient and methodical. He had lost on the boundary documentation. He had lost when she'd addressed the room at the social. He had lost on the recruitment letter because she hadn't responded, and silence was not the response he'd wanted. And now he was reaching for the thing that was most exposed. Her father. "We need to protect the farm," she said. "Court is looking at options." "What kind of options?" "The debt documentation is solid, and there's not much Garrett can actually do legally. But court wants to make sure there's nothing that could be argued ambiguous. He wants to file a clean record with the county that establishes the settlement in terms that can't be questioned." "How long does that take?" "A few weeks." She stood up and went to the window. The January landscape was flat and white and indifferent. "My father doesn't know." "No, I don't want him to know," she said. "Not unless something actually happens. He's just getting back on his feet. The worry alone would—" "I'll tell court," Ethan said. "We'll keep it contained." She turned back to the room. "Why is he doing this?" She said it not because she didn't know the answer, but because she needed to say it out loud. "You've been here 12 years. You've managed him for 12 years. Changed." Ethan looked at her. He didn't answer immediately. "Me," she said before he could. "I changed something." "You changed the calculation," he said. "Garrett planned this marriage as a way to get closer to leverage over me. You were supposed to be an obligation, something he could point to, something I'd feel indebted for. Instead, he paused. You became something else." "What?" He considered his words. A complication he didn't account for. "You're not silent and you're not contained. And every time he tries to apply pressure, he finds out that there's more of you than he planned for." He looked at the letter. "That bothers men like Garrett in a way that's hard to overstate. They build systems. They account for variables. And you have been, consistently, outside the system." She sat back down at the table. "So he's going after my father, because my father is the one place he thinks I'll fold." "Probably. He's not wrong," she said quietly. "That is the place." "I know," Ethan said. "That's why we're going to make it ironclad before he gets there." She looked at him. 4 months ago, she had sat at a table in this same kitchen, and he had said, "Your room is yours," and given her the key, and she had not known what to do with the kindness of it. She still sometimes didn't know what to do with him, the specific way he showed up, without fanfare, without requiring gratitude, without positioning his help as something she owed him. "Why do you do this?" she said. "What this?" "All of it. Fence line, the social, the lawyer." She stopped. "You didn't sign up for any of this." He looked at her steadily. "I signed up for the same thing you did." "Which was what, exactly?" "We didn't discuss it." "No," he said, "we didn't." He was quiet for a moment. "I'll tell you what I understood it to be. I understood it to be a practical arrangement that might become something more if we were both willing to work toward it and were reasonably compatible as human beings." "Are we? Are we what?" "Compatible." He looked at her across the table with an expression she'd been cataloging for months, the one that had started as unreadable and had gradually revealed itself as something more specific, a man paying close attention to something he valued. "I think you know the answer to that," he said. She did know. She had known for a while. She'd been carrying the knowing around and turning it over, the way she turned over questions that felt important before she said anything about them out loud. "This isn't what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "Tolerance. Maybe consideration." "Not," she stopped herself. "Not what?" he said, gently. She looked at her hands. "Not someone who actually sees me." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the wind was making its cold sound against the house. Agnes was somewhere in the back rooms. The ranch went about its ordinary business in the ordinary way. "I told you the first night," he said. "You don't have to pretend anything." "I know," she said. "I'm not pretending now." She meant it as a statement of fact, and he received it as one, which was exactly right, not dramatized, not made into a declaration, just two people being clear with each other across a kitchen table on a January afternoon. Court filed the clean documentation on the debt settlement in the first week of February. Filing was thorough and preemptive, and left no ambiguity about what had been paid, by whom, on what date, and under what terms. If Garrett tried to use Walt Dawson's farm as a pressure point, he would find a wall of documentation waiting for him. Mabel exhaled when Court's confirmation letter arrived, a specific bodily relief that she had been holding without knowing it. "It's done," Ethan said, reading it over her shoulder. "For now," she said. "For now is enough." She set the letter in the documentation box, which was getting full. Then she went outside because she needed air, and the February cold was what was available. She stood in the yard and looked at the ranch, the outbuildings, the fences Cal had tightened, the south wall of the barn, where the winter garden beds were sleeping under straw, waiting for March. She looked at the window where Agnes's light still burned in the evenings when they went out. She looked at all the small evidences of the last 5 months, the accumulations of ordinary days that had, without announcement, become a life. She heard the door behind her. Ethan came and stood beside her in the cold. "I've been thinking," he said. "About what?" "Spring," he said. "Eastern pasture rotation. If we do it the way you laid it out in October, we'll have room to expand the herd by summer. And if the creek holds water the way it should, now that Garrett's claim is dead, we have the range to support it. Significant investment." "Yes," he said. "Worth making, I think." She looked at the barn, the yard, the line of mountains beyond. "What kind of numbers are you thinking?" 20 head, to start. See how the pasture responds, 25, she said. "If the rotation goes well in the first month, you'll have room." She heard something in his breathing that might have been a small laugh. 25, he said, without argument. They stood in the February cold and talked about cattle and pasture and the practical mathematics of spring, and the wind came down off the mountains with its usual severity, and neither of them moved back toward the door. And it occurred to Mabel, standing there in her coat, with her boots on frozen ground, talking about livestock, that this was what it felt like to have a stake in something. Not belonging given to her, not belonging claimed through performance or apology or reduction. Belonging built, with her own hands, on her own terms. She didn't say any of this out loud. Some things didn't need to be said to be true. But she stood in the cold with the man who had, against all expectation, turned out to be someone she could stand beside. And she looked at the land that was beginning slowly, with effort, without perfection to feel like hers. And that was when she heard the horse, coming fast up the road, too fast for ordinary business. The kind of speed that means someone has ridden hard with news they didn't want to carry slowly. She and Ethan both turned. It was Drew, the young hand she'd sent to check the wagon wheel back in October, who had been less difficult since, and occasionally even useful. Pulled up in the yard with his horse, blowing hard, and his face, carrying the specific look of a person who has been told something, and ridden ahead of it. "Mr. Callahan," he said. His eyes went briefly to Mabel. "Ma'am, there's something happening in town." "What kind of something?" Ethan said. Drew took a breath. Garrett Holloway called a meeting. The grain exchange. Tonight. He's been sending word to every landowner in the valley since this morning. The meeting about? Drew looked uncomfortable in the way of someone delivering information they don't fully understand, but can tell is significant. I'm not sure exactly. But he's saying he stopped. People are saying he's going to raise the question of the Callahan Ranch land use. Something about whether the eastern operations comply with the valley water agreements. Mabel looked at Ethan. He looked at her. The water rights. The one angle he hadn't been able to press directly after the boundary meeting. He'd found another door, not the legal one, but the community one. A valley meeting, all the landowners present, where he could raise questions without documentation, where he could plant doubt without needing to prove anything, where the court was public opinion rather than county record. "Time," Ethan said. 7, Drew said. Ethan looked at Mabel. "We're going," she said before he could ask. "I know," he said. She went inside and got her coat, the heavier one, and her good boots, and she stood at the kitchen table for a moment and thought about the last 5 months and what they had built and what it was worth defending. She thought about her mother. She thought about her mother who had told her to know the difference between what she owed other people and what she owed herself. She thought about standing in a room and speaking when speaking cost something. She was not afraid. She was the kind of not afraid that comes from having survived enough things that new things lose their power to make the heart entirely stop. She picked up the documentation box. She was bringing the records. They drove to Copper Ridge in the dark with the documentation box on the seat between them and neither of them speaking much, which had become their particular language for serious things, not silence as absence, but silence as concentration. Two people thinking hard about the same problem from their own angles. The road was frozen solid, and the horses moved fast on it, and the mountains were black shapes against a sky that had gone the deep blue-gray of February night. Mabel held the box with one hand and watched the road with the other, and thought about Garrett Holloway standing in the grain exchange hall with the valley's landowners around him, and a question prepared and no documentation required to raise it. That was the thing about public opinion as a court. It had no rules of evidence. He's going to frame it as a community concern, she said. Yes. Water that belongs to everyone. The responsible stewardship of shared resources. She said it in the particular smooth cadence of a man who had practiced it. He'll make himself the voice of collective interest. And make me the man who puts his own gain above his neighbor's, Ethan said. Yes. I've been running through it. What do you have? The boundary documentation, the creek survey, 8 years of water usage, records that court pulled last month, and the water table data? I have what the county assessor published last spring. It's not Callahan specific, it's the whole valley. That's actually better, she said. If the water table is down across the whole valley, that's not your management. That's weather and regional conditions. Garrett can't pin drought on a single landowner, unless the room wants to believe he can. She looked at the dark road. Then we make sure they don't want to. The grain exchange was lit from within when they arrived. Lantern light pressing yellow against the windows, and there were horses and wagons already tied along the front more than she'd expected. Garrett had been thorough with his invitations. She counted at least 15 rigs before she stopped counting, which meant most of the significant landowners in the valley had come, plus probably several who weren't significant but had heard about the meeting and came for the same reason. People came to weddings they hadn't been invited to. They tied their own horses, and Mabel carried the documentation box, and they went in. The room went slightly different when they entered, not silent, not dramatic, but a perceptible shift in quality, the way a room shifts when the people being discussed walk through the door. She felt it on her skin and kept her face even and looked for Court. He was there. She hadn't expected that she hadn't known. Ethan had sent word, but there he was near the back wall with his coat still on and his watchful lawyer's expression in place. Caught Ethan's eye and nodded once, which communicated a significant amount without any of it being said. Garrett was at the front of the room, standing near a long table that had been set up in the way of official proceedings papers on it, a chair behind it, the architecture of authority. He was dressed well as always. He saw them come in, and his face performed welcome, while his eyes performed something more complicated. Callahan, he said across the room. Good. I was hoping you'd make it. Wouldn't miss it, Ethan said. His voice was easy. She had learned to understand easy as one of his more intentional registers. They found places to stand, not at the back, not at the front, somewhere in the middle where they could see the room and the room could see them. Cal was there, which surprised her. He'd followed on his own horse, apparently without being asked, and he was standing with two of the Outer Valley ranchers she'd begun to recognize at Thursday market. She looked at him. He looked back with the expression of a man who has decided something and doesn't require discussion. Ed Pruitt was there too, a broad-shouldered rancher from the northern end of the valley who had spoken approvingly about the social, and who, Cal had told her, was not in Garrett's pocket and had never been. Caught her eye and dipped his chin, which was a small thing that landed with more weight than its size suggested. Harriet Bloom was in the back corner. She ran dry goods, not land, but she attended everything and knew everyone, and had an influence that didn't announce itself. She was watching the room with the focused attention of someone keeping score. Garrett called the meeting to order at 7:05, with the ease of a man who has run meetings for a long time and considers them a natural extension of his authority. Thanked everyone for coming. He expressed his appreciation for the community spirit of the valley, the way neighbors showed up for one another when important matters arose. He built the frame carefully and competently before he put anything inside it. The argument itself took about 20 minutes. She had predicted the shape of it correctly, the language of shared resources, the responsibility of larger landowners to the collective well-being, and concerns raised by the dry conditions of the previous 2 years, and the need for coordinated management of the valley's water supply. He was careful not to name Ethan directly in the first 10 minutes, which made the accusation ambient rather than specific, and therefore harder to answer cleanly. When he finally arrived at the Callahan Eastern operations, the creek usage, the irrigation patterns, the volume of water the ranch drew from the watershed, he framed it as a question rather than a claim. He was concerned. He was simply raising something that had been raised with him by multiple parties. He wanted to open a conversation. It was well done. She gave him that. Ethan started to speak, and Mabel touched his arm once, briefly. He looked at her. She stepped forward. She had not planned to be the one to speak. She had planned to support Ethan, to hand him documents when he needed them, to be present in the way that presence communicates solidarity. But standing in that room with its lantern light and its assembled faces, and Garrett Holloway's carefully constructed question hanging in the air, she understood something. Garrett had underestimated her from the beginning, had built his entire strategy on the assumption that she was a variable to be managed, and the most direct answer to that strategy was to refuse, again and clearly, to be what he'd assumed. "I'd like to respond to that," she said. The room adjusted, some faces surprised, some already expecting it, some carefully neutral. Garrett's expression was smooth. "Mrs. Callahan," he said, with a particular intonation that made her title sound like a reminder of how she'd gotten it. Of course, she set the documentation box on the nearest table and opened it. "The Callahan Ranch draws water from the Eastern Creek, according to a usage pattern that has been consistent for the 11 years since the current water agreement was established," she said. "I have the records." She pulled out the sheaf Court had prepared, year by year, volume season, drought adjustments. The ranch has never exceeded the agreed allocation. In 3 of the last 8 years, we drew significantly below it. She looked at the room, not at Garrett. "I also have the county water table assessment from last spring." She pulled that out too. The water table reduction in this valley is documented across all properties, not concentrated at the Callahan boundary. Creek is running lower because of regional conditions, 2 dry winters and 1 dry spring. That is not management. That is weather. The point Garrett began. "I'm not finished," she said. She said it without heat, which was more effective than heat would have been. The point Mr. Holloway is raising is presented as a community concern. I want to address it as one. She looked around the room at Ed Pruitt, at Cal, at Harriet in the corner. The valley's water situation is a genuine issue. It deserved serious attention. What it does not deserve is to be used as a vehicle for pressuring a specific landowner who has been in compliance with every agreement on the books. The room was quiet. "This is the 3rd time in 4 months that questions have been raised about Callahan land, or Callahan conduct," she continued. "The eastern boundary, which was settled and documented 8 years ago. The water rights, which were formally challenged and dropped when the documentation was produced. And now this, a public meeting framed as community concern, called without notice, timed for an evening when preparation would be difficult." She heard the room shifting. Not dramatically, these were people accustomed to reading between lines, but shifting. "I'm not suggesting anyone in this room has bad intentions," she said, which was a careful use of the word Anyone that left Garrett precisely placed without her having to name him. I'm suggesting that genuine community concern deserves to be addressed with genuine community process, not with evening meetings designed to catch people unprepared. Garrett spoke. His voice had the controlled quality of a man deciding to change approaches midfield. Mrs. Callahan, your passion for your husband's interests is admirable, but the concerns raised tonight come from multiple members of this valley. Then let them speak for themselves, she said. A pause. Who specifically raised the concern about Callahan water usage? She looked at the room. I'd like to hear from them directly. The silence that followed was the specific kind that happens when a question has been asked that everyone in the room wants answered, and nobody is sure who should answer it. Ed Pruitt cleared his throat. I didn't, he said, just so it's clear. I got a letter saying there was a meeting about water rights, and I came because water rights matter to me. I didn't raise any concern about Callahan. A man named Vernon Ash from the south end of the valley said the same. Then a woman named Clara Mead, who ran a smaller spread with her brother and had always seemed to Mabel like a person who paid careful attention. I came because Garrett's letter said multiple landowners had concerns. I wanted to know who and what. I don't have a concern myself. The room had done the thing that rooms sometimes do when the architecture of a situation is exposed. It had looked at the frame and found it hollow, and now it was uncomfortable in the way that people are uncomfortable when they realize they've been assembled for a purpose that wasn't the stated one, the coat. Spotty. Garrett tried to recover. He had the skills for it, years of practice at managing rooms, and he made a credible attempt, redirecting to the genuine question of drought planning and collective water management, which were real issues, and he argued them competently. But the room had shifted underneath him, and competence wasn't enough anymore. It was Court who finished it, which he hadn't expected, but should have. He stepped forward from the back of the room, with the deliberate movement of a man who has been waiting for the right moment, and he addressed the room with the precise, unhurried language of someone who has spent a career knowing when to speak, what words survives in scrutiny. He outlined briefly but completely the documentation record, the water agreements, the compliance history, the boundary settlement, the county filing on the Dawson debt, which he mentioned not as an attack, but as an example of the kind of preemptive documentation that responsible parties maintain, which had the effect of making Garrett's inquiry into that record look exactly like what it was, without Court having to say so directly. He suggested that if the Valley wanted to address drought and water management collectively, which he agreed was worth doing, it should do so through the County Water Board, with proper process, transparent participation, and documentation that protected everyone's interests equally. That, he said, is how community concerns become community solutions. Garrett said something after that. She didn't fully track it because she was watching the room instead of him, and what she saw in the room was the thing she'd hoped for and hadn't been certain of: a quiet, practical, undramatic reorientation. Not condemnation of Garrett, not celebration of Mabel or Ethan. Just a room of working people who had come because they thought something important was happening and had figured out that the important thing was not what they'd been told it was. Ed Pruitt walked over to Ethan on his way out and shook his hand and said something she didn't hear. Vernon Ash nodded to her in the particular way that signifies respect without requiring elaboration. Harriet Bloom came through the crowd and put a hand briefly on Mabel's arm and said, "Well done," and moved on before Mabel could respond. Garrett left without speaking to either of them. Sinclair followed close behind. The room emptied in the ordinary way of rooms that have concluded their business. Court found them near the door. He looked at the documentation box. "You brought everything." "I had a feeling," Mabel said. He almost smiled, which for Court was approximately equivalent to another man laughing. "Water board idea will probably go forward," he said to Ethan. "It's a good idea, actually. Worth participating in." "We will," Ethan said. He looked at Mabel when he said it. They drove home through the February dark, and this time the silence was a different kind, not the concentrated, thinking silence of the drive-in, but the specific quiet of people who have been through something and are letting it settle. Stars were out in full, and the cold was absolute, and the horses moved at their own pace on the road home. After a while, Ethan said, "You didn't have to be the one to speak." "I know, but you did. Someone needed to, and I knew what to say." He was quiet for a moment. "You knew what to say because you'd been paying attention since September." "That's what I do," she said. "I know," he said. "I've been watching you do it." She looked at the road. The ranch would come over the ridge in another mile. Agnes's light would be in the window. "What happens now?" she said. "With Garrett." "He's not done," Ethan said. "Men like him are never done. Smaller now. In a room full of people who saw what happened, he's smaller. He'll recalculate. He always does. But he's running out of approaches that don't expose him." Ethan glanced at her. "We'll keep documenting. Keep being visible. Keep doing the work correctly. And making sure people can see that we are. That's a long game." "Yes," he said. "I've been playing it for 12 years. It's easier with 2. She let that sit. The mountains held the cold and the dark and the silence of things that don't need anything said about them. The ridge came. The ranch appeared. The window with its light. Carried the documentation box inside and set it on the kitchen table and stood in the warm kitchen for a moment, with the specific physical relief of a person who has been cold and is now not. Agnes had left bread, and there was soup still warm on the back of the stove, because Agnes had understood enough about where they were going to know they might come back hungry and cold. Mabel ladled soup without being asked, set 2 bowls on the table, sat down. Ethan came in and hung up his coat and sat across from her, and they ate soup and bread in the kitchen at 11 o'clock on a February night, and neither of them said very much, and it was completely ordinary, and nothing about it felt small. Spring arrived the way. Springs arrive after hard winters, not gently, not all at once, but in a series of negotiations between cold and warmth, each warmer day followed by a cold one, ground thawing and refreezing before it finally committed to mud and then to something more permanent. The kitchen garden emerged from under its straw mulch with the startled determination of things that have survived what they weren't certain they'd survive. The garlic came up first, which it always did, green spears pushing through soil that was barely ready for them. And Mabel stood over the beds one morning in March and felt something she had learned to allow herself uncomplicated satisfaction at a thing done right. Cal had been right about Hatch coming around. It happened slowly and was never acknowledged, which was the only way it could have happened between people with Hatch's particular makeup. He began doing small things, leaving tools where Mabel had mentioned she needed them, fixing the storage problem she'd identified in January without being asked, speaking to her in the mornings, with the brief utility of a man who has decided someone is worth talking to. She did not make a production of noticing. She just thanked him when he did something useful, the same way Sinksy thanked anyone. Drew, the youngest of the hands, had become something close to an ally without either of them fully articulating it. He was the one who had ridden fast with the news of Garrett's meeting, and she'd never forgotten that. He was 23 and had good instincts and was learning to trust them, and she thought he would be worth something considerable in a few years if someone kept giving him real work to do. The water board that Court had suggested was established in April, with county support and voluntary participation from the major landowners. Ethan joined. He brought Mabel with him to the first meeting, which was held at the county seat with a facilitator from the state land office and 12 landowners around a table. Garrett was also there. He had to be, given his holdings, and he participated with the smooth pragmatism of a man who understood that his best remaining move was cooperative visibility. He said reasonable things at the meeting, so did Ethan. Conversation was, for the most part, genuinely productive. She watched Garrett across the table and thought about everything he had done since September, the letter at the church steps, the boundary challenge, recruitment attempt, the Dawson debt inquiry, the evening meeting, and she thought about the gap between what he'd intended and what had actually happened. He had meant to acquire a manageable situation. He had gotten something that had cost him credibility with the valley's landowners and left him at a table where he had to be cooperative whether he wanted to be or not. She did not feel triumphant. She had thought about this in the way she thought about things she didn't want to get wrong, and what she felt was something more like the quiet satisfaction of having held her ground until the ground was worth something. That was different from winning. Winning implied a competition that was over. This was more like establishing a fact that would continue to be true as long as she kept doing the work that made it true. After the water board meeting, driving back, Ethan said, "He's adjusting." "I saw," she said. The Valley meeting backfired on him. He needs to be seen as cooperative now. Will he maintain it? Long enough for it to matter, Ethan said. He's practical. The calculation shifted. He'll accept what he can't change. He won't stop being who he is. No, Ethan said. Neither will we. She thought about that for the rest of the drive. Neither will we. The simplicity of it, the quiet claim that there was a we with a continuous nature, a we that had its own character and would carry it forward. 6 months ago, she would not have known how to hold that sentence. Now it fit in her hands, like something she'd been working with, long enough to understand its weight. Her father came to the ranch in May, on the first genuinely warm Saturday of spring, driving his own wagon, which he'd been able to do again since the debt was cleared. He arrived mid-morning and stood in the yard and looked at the property with the eyes of a man from a farming family who knows how to read land. It's a good operation, he said. It is, she said. He looked at the kitchen garden, which was in full spring production. By then, more beds than she'd started with, the rows straight and the soil dark and worked. He looked at the barn, the fences, the south pasture, where the new cattle were already showing the results of the adjusted rotation. He looked at all of it for a long time. You did some of this, he said. It was not a question. Yes, she said. He nodded slowly. He was not a man who overexpressed, which was something she'd inherited from him, or learned from him, or both. But she saw in his face what he didn't put into words, the complicated mix of things a parent feels when a child they feared for turns out to be all right, more than all right, turns out to have built something real in a situation that had looked like it might break them. I should have asked you, he said. Before I agreed to the arrangement, I should have. Pa, I should have, he said. I know you said it was fine, but it wasn't the right way to do it, and I've known that since the morning. She looked at him. I know, she said, and I know why you did it, and we're both here, and the farm is still yours, and this... She looked at the ranch, the garden, the south pasture. This is mine, so let's leave it where it is. He was quiet for a moment. Is he good to you? Pa, you asked me this in December. I'm asking again. She looked toward the barn, where she could hear Ethan working with Cal on something that required some discussion and at least one hammer. She stopped. Found the right word. He's honest. He doesn't perform things. He sees me as I am and works with what's actually there. She paused. Not a small thing. That's actually most of what matters. Walt Dawson looked at his daughter for a moment with the expression of a man seeing something clearly that he'd been worried about for a long time. Then he nodded. Good, he said. That's good, Mabel. They had lunch together. All four of them, Walt, Mabel, Ethan, Agnes at the long table in the dining room that had been purchased for a life that hadn't quite arrived and was now being used for it. Agnes had made more food than was necessary, which was her particular language for occasion. Walt ate 2 bowls of soup and 3 pieces of bread and talked with Ethan about spring planting and cattle prices and the county water board, with the ease of 2 practical men who have found common ground. It was not a perfect afternoon. Ethan said something about the northern fence that Walt misunderstood, and they had a brief, slightly awkward exchange before the clarification. Agnes burned the second batch of rolls and was audibly irritated about it. The table needed a leg shimmed and wobbled slightly when Walt put his elbows on it. Mabel forgot to bring out the butter until they were halfway through the meal. It was an ordinary afternoon of ordinary people eating a meal in a house where people lived, and it was the best afternoon she had spent in years. Walt left at 4, and she stood in the yard and watched him drive away and felt the specific sweetness of watching someone you love return to their own life in good condition. Ethan came up beside her. "He's a good man, he is," she said. "He made one very bad decision in a very hard situation. That's not all he is, no," Ethan said. "It's not." She looked at him. She had been looking at him for 6 months, learning his face, and there were still things in it she was discovering, which she had come to understand as a quality she valued rather than an uncertainty she feared. He was not a simple person. Neither was she. They were two people who had each spent years learning to get on without what they needed, and who had found, unexpectedly and imperfectly, that getting on with someone was a different and better thing. "I need to tell you something," she said. He waited. He was good at waiting. "When Garrett arranged this marriage, when my father agreed to it, I walked into that church, thinking the best I could hope for was tolerance. A man who would leave me alone and not make it worse." She looked at the yard, the garden, the fence line that ran true and even toward the mountains. "I didn't know what it would feel like to be inside something that was actually mine. I'd never had it. I didn't know the shape of it." He was quiet. "I know it now," she said. "That's what I wanted to say." He looked at her with that expression, the one she had spent months cataloging, the one that had started in unreadable, revealed as the face of a man paying close attention to something he valued. "I know it too," he said, "in case you were wondering." She hadn't been wondering, exactly. But there was a difference between knowing something and having it confirmed, and the confirmation mattered. That summer they brought in 27 head of cattle. She had negotiated him up from 25 to 27 in the second week of May. When the early pasture results confirmed there was room and the eastern rotation held exactly as she'd projected it would. And by August, the south pasture had recovered to productivity it hadn't shown in 3 years. She kept the supply ledger, the household accounts, and the parallel tracking system she'd started in the barn. Agnes kept the kitchen, but they consulted on the household budget now as a matter of course, in the easy way, each way of two people who trust each other's competence, without requiring it to be demonstrated every time. Cal ran the hands with his usual combination of patience and stubbornness, and Drew had been given the morning check responsibilities that had previously cost Ethan an hour of his day, and Hatch had, in somewhere around June, begun showing new hands the proper way to string fence line, which was its own form of institutional continuity. The ranch was not transformed. It was improved steadily, practically, in the way that things improve when someone pays attention to the actual problems rather than the visible ones. There were still broken things and difficult days and weeks when the work outpaced the available hands, and everyone was tired and short. The second summer calf died in July, despite everything, which was the hardest week of the season, and Mabel sat in the barn afterward and felt the loss without trying to argue herself out of it, because some things are just losses, and the only honest response is to let them be losses. She had learned that on the farm. She carried it here. County Water Board met quarterly and produced by October a drought management plan that all 12-member landowners signed. It was imperfect, compromise always is, but it was documented, transparent, and protected every operations allocation through the next dry winter, based on historical usage rather than whoever could argue loudest in a room. Ethan had pushed for the historical usage provision. She had drafted the language with Court. Garrett Holloway signed the plan last, with the deliberate care of a man committing to something he hadn't chosen, but had calculated the cost of refusing. She watched him sign it. He looked up and met her eyes across the table. She did not look away. She did not smile. She simply held his gaze with the level attention of a woman who knows exactly what she is, which was something she had not been able to do on the morning of her wedding, when she was still carrying other people's versions of her and hadn't yet figured out how to set them down. He looked away first. The Thursday market in October one year, almost exactly. From the first Thursday, she'd gone alone and encountered Ruth Meacham, and Sylvia Porter at the general stores was a different kind of morning than that one had been. She drove in herself, same as always, in the same wagon. But Henry Ware greeted her by name when she came through the door, with the ease of someone for her presence had become ordinary rather than notable. The supply order she'd put in the previous week was already pulled and ready, which he'd started doing about 3 months ago. Sylvia Porter was not at the general store. She was at the dry goods booth across the market, and their paths crossed briefly in the street between, and Sylvia said, "Good morning, Mabel," with the careful neutrality of a woman who has decided that neutrality is the available option. And Mabel said, "Good morning, Sylvia," with the same neutrality, and they each went their separate directions. That was all. That was enough. She was not in the business of requiring apology from people who would never give it genuinely, and she was not in the business of pretending that what had been said hadn't been said. She was in the business of walking through the market on her own terms and buying what the ranch needed and going home to the work that was waiting. Harriet Bloom stopped her near the end of the market with a question about spring seed suppliers that became a 20-minute conversation about soil conditions and rotation schedules and the particular challenges of dry year planting. Harriet had sharp opinions and good information, and by the end of the conversation, they had agreed to share notes over the winter, which was the beginning of something that would continue for years for me. Mabel drove home with the wagon loaded and the mountains ahead and the October light doing what October light does. In the valleys going golden and specific in the way that makes everything look like it has been chosen carefully. She thought about what it meant that a year had passed. She had arrived at the Callahan Ranch in September with a bag that contained her whole life and a letter from Garrett Holloway folded in her fist and a face trained to not show what she felt. She had arrived expecting tolerance. She had arrived braced against the next reduction, the next person, with the measuring stick they hadn't been asked to carry. What she found instead was something she still didn't have a perfectly clean word for, because the words that existed for it tended toward the dramatic or the sentimental, and what she'd actually built was neither of those things. Daily. It was practical. It was made of supply ledgers and fence line, repairs and soup left warm on a February night, and a paragraph folded into a letter sent to a lawyer in February. It was made of two people who had found, against expectation, that they were better at the things that mattered when the other person was in the room. She thought about what her mother had told her at 15, about the difference between what you owe other people and what you owe yourself. She thought she understood it more completely now than she ever had before. It was not a license for selfishness. It was a warning against the particular kind of erasure that happens when you let the world's version of you become louder than your own. When you accept, gradually and without meaning to, that your own needs are not real needs, that your own voice is not a real voice, that the amount of space you take up in a room is a problem to be managed rather than a fact of your existence. She had done that for 31 years. She had been very good at it. She had called it practical, and called it surviving, and called it choosing battles, and all of those things were true. And they were also, she could see this now, from the other side of it, a form of slow disappearance. She was not disappearing anymore. She was not what Garrett Holloway had planned for. She was not what the women at the Harvest Social had expected. She was not the manageable situation that anyone had arranged. She was a woman who ran half the operations of a working ranch and kept the accounts in 3 parallel systems and could fix a fence line and identify a supply problem and speak in a room full of people when speaking cost something. She was a woman who had planted a kitchen garden in October and watched it survive a mountain winter and come back in March with the specific stubbornness of things that have decided to persist. She was a woman who had walked into a church in a borrowed dress that didn't quite button and walked out of it into something she had not yet fully understood but had been building ever since. She was not finished. She was not perfect. She made mistakes miscalculated once on the feed order in August in a way that cost them 2 weeks of scrambling, said the wrong thing to Agnes in June during a week when she was tired and short and owed a genuine apology, which she gave. She had days when the weight of having arrived in this life sideways, through a transaction, through a letter thrown at her feet, days when that weight made the back of her throat tight in a way she didn't always know how to clear. But she had this, the work that was hers, the land that received it, person beside her who did not require her to be smaller in order to make his own size legible. That was not nothing. In her life, in the life of most people she had ever known, that was the whole of it. She came over the last ridge, and the ranch appeared below her, the way it always did the house, the barn, the outbuildings, the kitchen garden at the south wall, the fences running true in all directions. Agnes's wagon was in the yard, which meant she'd come back from her own town errand. The horses in the east pasture were moving toward the water trough in the late afternoon way of horses who have learned the schedule and kept to it, and Ethan was in the yard. He was doing something with a fence post that needed adjustment near the gate. She could see him from the ridge, the particular stance of a man working on a problem with his hands. He heard the wagon coming and straightened and looked up. She was still far enough away that she couldn't see his expression clearly, but she knew what it looked like. She had been learning it for a year, and she knew it the way you know, the things you have paid close attention to. Not as a performance, not as something owed, but as the particular face of someone who has registered that you are coming home. She drove down the ridge and into the yard, and he took the horses' heads while she climbed down, the same as he'd been doing since the first week, the practical division of a task that required two people, nothing romantic about it, and something essential about it at the same time. Good market, he said. Good market, she said. Harriet Bloom and I are going to share seed notes over winter. Is that useful? Very. He nodded. I fixed the gatepost. It was listing about 4 inches. I saw from the ridge. Did you see it was listing, or did you see I'd fixed it? Both, she said. The post is straight now. He made the sound that was approximately a laugh. She took the documentation box from the wagon. She brought it to the market sometimes, when she had business with court or the county office, and carried it inside. The kitchen was warm. Agnes had something on the stove that smelled like the onions from the garden. The late afternoon light came through the window, at the angle it came through in October, long and specific, lying across the kitchen table, like something placed there deliberately. She set the box on the table. She stood in the kitchen for a moment and let herself be in it, the warmth, the smells, the light, the specific ordinary fact of a place that was hers. This was what she had not known the shape of a year ago, this particular quality of ordinary. Not the exceptional moments, not the grain exchange or the harvest social or the water board meeting. Those were the visible things, the things that could be told. This was the invisible thing underneath them. The daily accumulation of small choices that had added up without announcement into a life. You could not earn it once and keep it. That was the part nobody told you clearly enough. You earned it every day, in the specific choices you made about how to hold yourself, who to trust, what work to do, and how carefully to do it. It was not a destination. It was a practice, and the practice was hard and imperfect, and sometimes exhausting. And also, and this was the thing she had not believed until she was living, it also sustaining. The way difficult things that are genuinely yours are sustaining in a way that easy things that belong to someone else never are. She heard Ethan come in behind her. She heard him hang up his coat. She heard the ordinary sounds of a person settling into an ordinary evening. Soup, he said. I know, she said. I can smell it. She turned around. He was standing at the edge of the kitchen with his hat still in his hand, looking at her with the expression she knew, the one that had started unreadable and had revealed itself over time as the face of a man who sees what's in front of him clearly and chooses it. Good day, he said. She thought about the market, about Harriet Bloom and the seed notes, about Sylvia Porter and the neutral good morning, about Garrett Holloway's signature at the bottom of the waterboard plan, about her father driving home in good condition, about the garlic coming up in March when the ground was barely ready, about all of it, the whole accumulated year. Yes, she said, and meant it completely. The kitchen held them in its ordinary evening light. and outside the ranch went about its business in the way it always did, the horses settling, the hands finishing their last tasks, the October dark coming down off the mountains with its characteristic unhurried certainty, and nothing about any of it was perfect, and all of it was real. And real was the thing she had spent her whole life reaching for, without knowing quite what she was reaching for. She knew now. It looked like this.